Welcome to the Level Design Podcast, in which we look at the world of game development through the lens of level design. In this episode, we bring back one of our original panelists that kicked this podcast off, the infinite Steve Lee. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am Mark Drew, and joining me in diving down the rabbit hole is Rob McLaughlin, hailing from the Chinese room. Hello, Rob.
Good evening.
How's sunny Brighton?
Very sunny.
Awesome. And also your mafioso friend by the beach, Jonathan Wilson from Hangar 13. Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, it's always good to be back.
We have a deep dive from last episode with you, so I think people now know all about you.
Just a bit. It wasn't like a massive interrogation or anything, but we'll see.
Next time. Quizzing from the frozen north, Scotland, is a genius that is Valentina Crisostomu. Welcome back, Valentina.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and I sound like a Game of Thrones character from the frozen north, so that's great too.
Yeah. From the Great Wall. And sitting in the hot seat this week, with a lamp shining into his poor eyes, we're interrogating the infinite and slightly dishonored Steve Lee. Hello, Steve.
Hey, how's it going? I've never been called infinite before. So I'll take that positively.
This is going to be a really long podcast. How long is it? Infinite. Some new listeners to the podcast might not know that this podcast, if you go all the way back to episode 1, was actually from a panel at EGX. If you know this, don't worry. You can listen to Steve in the first episode, which was slightly bad quality, I think, in audio. But so we're trying to redress that by having you back on the show, and with better equipment, high production values, and his own starring role.
It may have been bad quality in equipment, but it was superb content.
Yeah.
Incredible. Infinite content.
So for people that don't know, you've got quite a distinguished career. I don't want to go through the whole point, but some of the highlights are some of, I think, our favorite games is Bioshock Infinite, John Wick Hex, and another favorite of mine, which is Dishonored 2, in fact.
Yeah, just Dishonored 2, not 1. Typically, but yeah.
I mean, really, you've worked on some of the most influential levels in game design out there. These are all the ones that have really impacted me anyway, and that means that those are the best ones.
To be clear, I didn't work on the levels that everybody talks about from Dishonored 2. I didn't work on the time travel one in the
Nor the Clockwork Mansion.
No, yeah. But yeah, I was really happy to work on Dishonored 2. Dishonored 1 is probably one of my favorite games of all time. So I was super happy to work on that. I've worked in AAA for 10 years after Dishonored 2, and that was the fourth one, and it was a lot of moving around for every. I literally moved country for every game I worked on in 10 years of AAA. I worked on a game called Wheelman up in Newcastle in England, but then I moved to Warsaw in Poland to work on Bulletstorm, and then Boston in the US for Infinite, and France for Dishonored 2. And so it was really a time in my life when I was just chasing jobs basically, and seeing the latest trailer to a game that I really wanted to work on and go, oh, that looks really cool, and being lucky enough to land it. You
chased each of those jobs quite successfully, to be fair. It's
obviously there were interviews I didn't land and stuff like that, but the Dishonored one was really kind of good timing in a lot of ways, I think.
But in current situation, do you think this is going to be a continuing trend that people have to travel to completely different countries to work on games?
Well, given the current circumstances, remote working might become more of a thing, although maybe not in AAA. I still don't know if remote is really practical for long term for AAA, but but I suppose it is in the sense, especially if you're fussy like me about the kind of games you like and stuff. There's not many. If you love first-person shooters, let's say, there's not many first-person shooters. There's only a handful you can pick from in the world if you want to work on AAA ones. So to some degree, it will definitely always help if you're willing to move, for sure. It's not like I don't know, web development or something where every company in every country needs a website.
It's quite niche, isn't it?
Yeah, say if you're fussy, you've got to be willing to move around, or it helps. certainly in AAA.
One of the things that I always wondered was, I mean, you've had like a very illustrious career, but you managed to go to, Wheelman is like a pretty big game for someone that came out of university, right?
Yeah, I remember being really happy with that, because I just to kind of get into the AAA end of things was my goal, basically. I was always really into the first person games, and Wheelman wasn't first person, but I was just happy to be in a, pretty big budget looking thing, relatively speaking. And it was novel that it was a Vin Diesel game as well. It was after Butcher Bay, but it was like a third person open world kind of car chase thing. I know I was really happy to get into the AAA end of things. And then Bulletstorm after that was the first person shooter game, which was kind of the big draw for me at the time, as well as moving to Poland, which was kind of quite an adventure as well. Yeah, I've kind of always been into the AAA end of things, really, even though my last few years have been like freelance and working with smaller teams and indie stuff, like including like the John Hex thing and John Wick thing. But yeah, I'm glad to have got the AAA thing.
Which was your favorite city?
I have a soft spot for Warsaw. I really loved Warsaw in terms of it kind of got me out of my shell, and I hadn't travelled a huge amount before that at all, like really. And so that was a big part of it as well. The other part was just moving to another place. As soon as I got there for the interview, I remember just thinking like, I don't even know about the job, but I'd love to do it. It'd just be bonkers, basically. And yeah, it was quite good fun. And I just remember that it felt like, so People Can Fly, the company that made Bulletstorm, they felt like a really, as somebody who came from the kind of Doom and Quake lineage of level design, those are the games that got me into it. People Can Fly felt like a really nice place to be. I remember the first day I was there, I remember I think it was an artist sat a couple of desks away from me. He had a Doom poster on his desk, but then he was just sitting there playing electric guitar, and I was like, this is what video game development used to be back in the day. People just playing an electric guitar with Doom posters everywhere.
Did he go outside, get into his Ferrari, and
not until after the massive yeah, that was a real big kind of adventure for me, and to kind of to do an old school shooter of sorts was really satisfying for me.
Where do you think the biggest kind of bumps in your level design knowledge, where do you feel like you made the biggest leaps forward in terms of your expertise as you moved through your career? In terms of how you thought you had a handle on how level design worked and how good you were at it, I guess.
I mean, there was pretty interesting lessons from all of them. Like the Wheelman, the first game, was interesting as a first thing because it was kind of being, and this was a topic throughout the development, it was kind of pulled in two directions at once because it was an open world game, which is typically very systemic and emergent and all this kind of thing, but we were consciously going for the scripted cinematic thing. So we were trying to script really controlled things in an open world where you can turn left at any point and you can turn, and we had to constantly think about, well, what if the player just doesn't go down that road, and we had to make up excuses for blocking roads off. And the game was set in Barcelona as well. It was like an open world Barcelona, so it wasn't handcrafted pretend video game city where we could kind of contrive things a bit.
Barcelona famously gridded, you can go anywhere at any point, can't you?
Right, yeah, and so that was a really interesting one there, just kind of seeing how the challenges of trying to do a game which is kind of has two parts of it that are maybe in tension and, sometimes in an interesting way and sometimes in a difficult way. I'd say Bioshock Infinite was a really big thing in terms of learning how a really story-driven thing has a lot of its own demands as well, when it's kind of like this part of the game really is about this thing that happens to Liz, or this this thing that happens in the story, and especially if that the process was quite intense at times, and there's kind of things changing a lot and stuff like that, so there's a lot of everything coming in hot and but trying to make it work in a story way and not just getting gunplay and combat in there, so that was quite an intense one, I suppose. And then Dishonored was probably the most complicated I've worked on in terms of just the sheer amount of demands that on a level, the density of a level and the scale of it, but also the demands on the level from both a level design and an environment art perspective, where both sides of the coin are really, we really care about everything. If this ledge is too high, level design is annoyed, and if that ledge doesn't make sense, environment art is really annoyed, and so there's a lot of discussion, and thankfully that was the first team I worked on where the level designers and the environment artists actually sit next to each other, like because we're working on the same mission for most of 2 or 3 years, because it'd just be impossible to make a Dishonored level, or it wouldn't be advised to do it without that kind of setup. Yeah, just the sheer amount of complicated things you have to think about at every stage of a Dishonored level, I suppose, when you're trying to get things done. That was a massive learning experience, I suppose.
What's the most challenging thing about working on a Dishonored level because you have all these abilities? How do you even start thinking about creating a level from scratch for that kind of game?
I suppose I can only comment having worked on a sequel, so it's like, one of the benefits of a sequel is that you kind of know what the game is, and as much as there were lots of new powers in Dishonored 2, the scope of them wasn't hugely bigger than the first one. So in terms of, like, for example, taking care of whether or not the player can teleport out of the level somehow, like blink out of the level or something like that, the scope of what the player could do physically was pretty similar and things like that. So yeah, working on a sequel is a blessing in that sense. Really, it boils down to like say you quickly get a sense of like, well, okay, double jump plus upgraded blink plus bend time means you can do this. And possess is occasionally a nightmare. Yeah, just you end up being quite good at coming up with excuses for buildings to be quite tall, and like and justifying. It's like in a shooter, you're always good at justifying crate-shaped things in your level and stuff like this. It's like in Dishonored, especially because we care about the world building and the Karnaca as a believable place and stuff. You think quite early on, like, okay, if your map is set in the streets, then we need reasons for these streets to be blocked off, and the artist needs to come up with a way to block them off in a way that doesn't just look like a video game street blocked off for no reason.
And vertically as well, so like the blocking off is actually going way above all the other buildings anyway.
Yeah, and then, which is an interesting one, because on one hand, Dishonored, the art direction and the architectural reference usually involves quite grand, tall buildings and stuff, but at the same time, one of the kind of aspects of the Dishonored fantasy is the assassin who skulks around on rooftops, right? So you need some rooftops that you can get to, but then you need to be able to make sure that the rooftops next to it are so high that you can't get to them and stuff like that. But it's kind of, I don't know, if you go in there with that in mind from the start, and like I say, if you played the first one and you're kind of quite familiar with it, it's manageable, thankfully. But then there's even once you get all that stuff done, it's usually the nitty gritty of like the particulars of your level that are the complicated thing to think about. Like in my case, I worked on the Dust District, and the thing about that level was that there were 2 factions and 2 targets, and civilians in the middle of it. And so you could choose to infiltrate either building with either target, and then the goal was to, unless you do one of the kind of alternate ways of doing the mission, the goal was to bring back the body of one of the leaders and take it to the other one. The nightmares there aren't so much things like, oh, what if the player can jump out of the level, but it's more like, what if the player possesses the leader of this faction and walks over to the other side of the map? And usually that's okay, because the response is then this NPC gets angry at you and starts a fight, and that's kind of managed. But then there are loads of cases where it's like, oh, but what if they walk past, like, this is the leader of this gang who people know in the area. What if you walk past the civilians? Don't they talk about that? And then suddenly it's like, oh, maybe we need some backs for, like, if a civilian sees the NPC, this leader in this area of town, and then what happens when you unpossess him and the leader of this faction is suddenly found himself like in the middle of a street market? What does he do? And there's just that's the weirdest stuff, more than the kind of ninja player jumping around all over the place stuff. It's more the kind of the narrative details of like, what if like possession's a nightmare. Well, it can be a nightmare with when there's a lot of important characters, basically. But yeah, it tends not to be the actual like where the player can go stuff, because that's relatively easy to be able to get a handle on. Once you get a feel for, like, we know that upgraded blink is 6 meters far, for example, and stuff like that. You can kind of start. I think we came up with a little measuring tool in the editor to check stuff like that a bit quicker. But even that's quite fuzzy, because then you've got like running sprint jumps off ledges and then blinking and stuff like that. It's quite tricky. The other one that kind of is quite different to most other games, because I come from like in terms of scripting narrative stuff, like Half-Life 2 is a big one for me, where you become good at creating situations where you walk around a corner and it looks like all kinds of stuff has been happening all this time, when really obviously you just set it up to happen when you walk around that corner. I learned early on with Dishonored how you can't do that, because the player can stop time and teleport. So if you stop time and you've set if you've scripted something to trigger and kick into action when the player walks around a corner, or even 4 corners away, the player can stop time 5 corners away, double blink and just run towards that event, and then either there's an NPC who isn't even there, or maybe the NPC is still playing its kind of getting ready to do things animation before you're supposed to see it and stuff like that. And yeah, there's lots of nightmares, and so you basically got to set up most of the level to truly be alive all the time, at least in some basic way.
It's harder to hide things basically when you have all these abilities.
Yeah, you just can't have a trigger box that like unleashes all the like bad guys.
Yeah, so you got to think in terms of like everybody has a patrol path. Well, most of them have a patrol path. Everybody has an idle animation or something they're doing when they're not doing anything, so that if the player just happens to be able to pause and just get there somehow, you can see it and it looks reasonable.
Yeah, having too many trigger boxes, and especially big ones, would be a nightmare for performance. So there has to be other ways to work around that.
You've got to think four-dimensionally.
Well, I suppose it, like I said, it kind of forces you to truly simulate things to some degree, which usually helps and ends up helping the game in a way as well, because then it's cool when you, as a player, when you notice that, oh wow, that's actually kind of working how you'd expect it to. And there's things like, and sometimes you get that for free because of the way the game works, and sometimes you kind of script it to support this cool thing that should happen. There's a part in the Overseer kind of building where there's a scene where I kind of borrowed an idea from Dishonored 1 but did it a bit differently. There's a scene where one Overseer is injured and lying on a bed, and his friend is kind of mercy killing him because he's not going to make it, basically. And they go through this whole speech, and then he pulls his sword out and puts it, I think, in his neck and just kills him, basically, but in this kind of mercy kill kind of way. And it occurred to us at one point that, if you possess the guy who is getting the sword put in his neck, you should die when the sword goes in your neck. And then and that wasn't, damage wasn't being caused to that NPC, so we had to set that up in the cutscene kind of thing. But then as soon as that damage is caused to the NPC and they actually die in terms of the game state and stuff, if you possess that guy, then you do die, because that is handled by the system. And it was nice when kind of stuff like that comes out of just simulating things properly.
That's kind of amazing.
That's a lesson for life. Don't possess someone that's about to be killed, right?
It's pretty amazing how much detail there is in that game, because you would think, if it was maybe another studio, they'd be like, oh, just disable it for that person so you can't possess him and problem solved, boom, bam, and you don't even work on it. But then you actually left the ability to be able to possess it, and you actually die. That's kind of a nice thing to happen with the existing systems of the game, and you can accidentally encounter it and be surprised by it. I think that's the magic that Arcane Studio games have. Prey and Dishonored have all these kind of different systems working together, and they create these magic moments that you may not even see. And it's a tiny thing. If you imagine, it's not even part of the game. You can just do it, and there will be an outcome that will work with the game, and it's not going to crash or create a bug or something.
Do you think that's how they did Prey?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Prey is in some ways even more simulated and kind of systemic than Dishonored, I'd say, with it being kind of a mini open world type kind of thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, with Dishonored being quite an open-ended game, and I guess each of the levels were almost like sandboxes in themselves, was there ever a point where you had to draw the line and be like, this is not necessarily going to be seen? When do you draw the line of not supporting what could potentially be possible for the player to achieve? Was there ever a rule box in place for that, or was it just you had to try and account for every eventuality?
We tried to always support things that should happen according to the way the game works.
Mm-hmm.
But then, and if there was ever a situation that, basically we tried to avoid designing situations in the first place that create situations that we wouldn't be able to support like that. And that's if a situation came up with just too many what about if the player does this, maybe it would be unfortunately, the two level design leads on the team, they were the same ones from Dishonored 1, but also they've been working together at Arcane for a long time, so they were used to the whole what about this kind of conversation. I don't know if there's a hard rule for it. So you're always just kind of judging like how much of a nightmare is this going to be for us versus how cool is it going to be, and does it make sense within the context of the game and the level and stuff like that.
I always find it can be quite a fascinating conversation, because obviously every game has its own rule set or its own systemic design to a degree, and obviously that conversation always has to be had, like in every mission, like how far do you go with the what if scenario, and some really cool stuff always comes out of it as well, because like, yeah, but what if they approach this way, and then you can get something really cool out of that as well. But it's always fascinating, so I find it interesting to see how different people approach it from different styles of games.
Yeah, and I think the what ifs are what take the longest time in development. This is why the game is delayed, or this is why takes time to. This is what we call polish. We kind of have to like work around all the situations. Otherwise, if we didn't have to work around them, we'd just release the first version.
Yeah, it's also why you iterate on levels so much, right? It's like that first implementation, it's like, oh yeah, that's cool, but it only works if I play it in this one very specific way, and then you start iterating on it and fleshing it out. So
yeah, because when you play it as a designer, you play it as intended. Usually, you might stray away here and there, but then when someone else plays, like a game tester comes and plays it, and you see just the different ways, and it's just like you're just biting your nails. What are you doing? Why are you playing it that way? Stop it! But then you realize, this is, the first version that you put out there is very, very rough.
I think another part of it is on the game design side as well, and also the programming side, like the way I think it becomes easier for level designers to answer some of those questions when a lot of the problems are solved by good game designers and programmers who are programming things in a very systemic way from the beginning, because they know that this is the kind of game it is. And so, in that example I gave where I had to add a little thing to make sure that the player died if you possess that guy who's been killed, I didn't say anything like that specific, where it's like if the player possesses this guy, you die. It was more that I only had to add the pain impulse in the animation to say that this NPC dies, and then, like I said, the game handled the player doing it, And so there's a lot of, I think it goes to the same thing applies to the how do you kind of cater for the insane amount of things the player can do. Thankfully, half of that job is done for you by good game design, in the sense of the people designing the mechanics are thinking about, well, is this too much? At one point, it sounded like one of the upgrades to possession would be that you could possess the head of a corpse, like a severed head, which we quickly, somebody must have quickly realized that's nuts, because then suddenly you could possess a physics object and you could throw yourself over buildings and all kinds of stuff. That quickly got sliced out. But like,
no, that's a game mechanic I'm adding. I'm definitely adding.
Yeah, that would have been a perfect successor to the thief idol.
Yeah,
you could actually throw a dead head you see around corners, with this sort of head sitting there looking at people. Brilliant.
So game design, making those kind of judgments, like that's too much, solves that problem for level design.
I mean, you also have to hope that they do say that's too much, because otherwise it ends up in front of you. It's like, oh, I made this really cool thing. Yeah, maybe not. It's like, as much as it's super, but I do like the opportunity to experiment with stuff like that. Like, sometimes it doesn't make it into the game. Like, you used the example of possessing a head. As soon as you run through, so I guess so many simulations in your mind, or so many ideas, you kind of suddenly realize, yes, these are cool, but he's the bag of worms it opens up if it actually goes into the game.
This idea was expanded in Prey, though, right? So you can possess inanimate objects and just jump and move around
That's
them.
true, yeah, that's true.
So that kind of worms was opened afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, but I suppose they did it in a completely enclosed spaceship, which is although you can go outside, you can go into space.
You can, but I don't think you can do it while possessed, yeah.
I don't think you can possess something and go into space, but I guess you could possess something in space. I mean, not that it'll matter, you'd just be floating. But...
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, yeah, they've got space, space handles it, basically.
But you've been, after all these games, after that, you came back and started working as a freelance game developer, really, focusing on level design, which is how you found White Paper Games, or you already knew them? Because you worked on The Occupation as well.
Yeah, I consulted with them a little bit and visited them up at the studio a bunch of times, helping out with the discussion on like level design stuff and some narrative design stuff and systemsy stuff. Well, it's still my only kind of indie first-person game I've worked on, so it's cool to work on something that was immersive sim-like, but on a smaller scale. It's cool. I noticed you had them on this podcast, right?
Yeah, I talked to Peter at Develop last year. The Occupation, for those who haven't played it, is kind of like a game that takes about 4 hours. Like, it's real time 4 hours. Someone stopped me from getting this wrong. I think I have an Occupation t-shirt. In an environment that people are patrolling and real things are happening in those 4 hours. You have to kind of complete the game in those 4 hours. So this is kind of going back to what you were saying about Dishonored, which you can't really fake a lot of that. The people are doing their patrols and stuff.
Or at least you have to up your game with the faking. I imagine there is, like, I think it's just the nature of game development that you're always faking as much as you can so that you can do stuff as best as you can, basically. Like, you know, and like I said, there's some stuff with certain games that you can't fake, or you gotta fake better. But I think, yeah, you're always kind of trying to find the cleverest way of doing things so you can do more, kind of thing. To be honest, I don't know the ins and outs of what's truly going on in the background of the occupation, if you're in like a different building and stuff like that. I do recall that, yeah, the key NPCs are like still walking around and have routines and all this kind of stuff.
And they can get tired and distracted, and also can notice stuff, which I guess has happened in some other games, but not to that level. If you leave a door open, they'll be like, wait a minute, why is that door open? And then they'll stop their routine and go in and investigate that room, and you got to be hiding there. It's a very interesting one. But your next big role was at John Wick Hex with Bithell Games. Now that's a bit different for someone that's been doing first person.
Yeah, that was really kind of random and awesome in the sense that, like, I remember I saw the tweet that Mike sent out about looking for level designers, and he was living in London at the time. He's not anymore, and I'm here in London. So we when I got in touch, we met up and stuff. And when he told me it was John Wick, I was like, really? And it kind of took a moment to like think, how did you get that? That's amazing. And I'm a big like action movie / martial arts geek as well. So like that was really, I've kind of been designing that kind of game in my head for a while. And so that was really like, oh wow, I'd love to be on this. Like, and yeah, it was really nice to work on something that it ticked a few boxes in terms of being like an old school game where you're a guy who just beats everybody up and gets to the end of the level, and there's like this many levels and you just got to do it, and they get harder. And I like the idea of working on the entire campaign as well. So like, yeah, it was me and an artist, but in terms of the level design of it, I did, because they're relatively simple, in terms of the complexity of what goes on. So yeah, it was within scope for me to I was basically the level designer. I did all of them, kind of thing, based on concept art they already had and art assets they already had and stuff like this.
So for people that haven't played John Wick Hex, it's basically a kind of XCOM. That's a really bad analogy, but it's an XCOM timed. You got like time units so you can move or reload, and if you do like a throttle, that takes X amount of time compared to a reload.
Yeah, it's like pseudo real time tactical thing. Yeah, like because it wasn't like, yeah, it's like if you move one step forward and that's like your turn, but then as you move, the world moves as well, kind of thing. So it's like Super Hot was the game that we often like a tactical Super Hot, but with like guns and martial arts, which is cool. Because I helped out with some of the mechanic stuff as well, and like I remember it was just at the same time that Mike did his trip to presumably LA. He met the stunt team and did a bit of like martial arts stuff with them just to kind of get a feel for it. I think there's a bit as a clip on a DVD somewhere. On the John Wick DVD, in fact, the third film. So it turns out that John Wick, the martial arts style he does is like a mix of jiu-jitsu and aikido, and I'm really into judo, and I'm really like, my brother teaches jiu-jitsu and I'm quite into that particular thing. So I was like, oh, I kind of gave a few kind of suggestions on how we could get it more like jiu-jitsu rather than like more specific to that thing. And it was really satisfying to kind of help. I suppose one thing is just that it was really satisfying to help out with not just the martial arts thing in a combat game, but also like to help out with the game design on a game where I was making the levels for it. Because it's really useful when you can say like, this would be really useful for me as a mechanic, and this is how, in combination with these levels, I think we could create something that feels like John Wick. Like, and a key thing for the levels on that game was that it had to be all about really tight spaces. Like even like in the films, I think in the films it has to be tight spaces. Well, it's kind of the same thing in the sense that in both instances, you've basically got to justify why people aren't just shooting John Wick in the head from 10 meters away. And so he's got to have cover all the time, or he's got to be moving so fast that there's an excuse that that guy with the gun didn't get him. And so, yeah, one of my first level design tests was basically a level made from the first level design test I did, which is a level where it was literally you just dancing between columns it was in a museum, like an art museum in the end. And it was basically the tightest possible level I could think of, where you're just constantly dancing in and out of cover while you beat up guys who you can see and then you can't see if you move into the square and all this kind of thing, into the cell. So yeah, it was all about like the level design, and that was realizing it was all about, even though we were, especially Mike, he was like super conscious of the idea that it's not a cover shooter, but still line of sight is incredibly important to it, even though it wasn't about hiding, like poking up and down from cover kind of thing. Yeah, so that was really nice to work on a game like that, and in contrast to first-person shooters in a way. And like I say, I kind of got to scratch that itch of making a martial artsy thing as well.
Because I guess martial artsy thing looks much better from like a third-person perspective than it would do like in first-person. I mean, I guess Dishonored's a little bit, but you're not doing like, throws or like punches.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah,
it's going to look epic from third-person.
Yeah, totally. And I think, and there's also like, I think that's the first person versus third thing. And there's also like, I think a lot of, it was interesting how it made me realize how different people see John Wick in their own way, in the sense that for me, because I like martial arts stuff and I kind of know a bit about jiu-jitsu, broadly speaking, like to me, John Wick is a martial arts film with guns in it, whereas to other people, he's kind of a tactical guns guy who occasionally does martial arts. And so I remember I felt like I was always trying to pull it in the martial artsy direction, partly because, not just because I like martial arts, but because I felt like that was where the depth in the mechanics was as well. If ultimately in John Wick shooting someone, it was just literally just clicking on them, whereas to get close to them and to decide where you're going to move to after you throw somebody to be in a better position the next turn and stuff like that was, yeah, to me that was where all the meat of the game was in terms of tactical decisions and stuff like that. It's one of those games where, like most games, I suppose, where it would have been great to have more time and kind of really flesh things out.
We all hope for that, right? We all get to the point where it's like, this would be much better if I could do this as well.
but how you take that, I think, is instead of just like, going, oh damn it, I wish I could have done this for this game, is you then take all of those ideas and put them in a book, and then you can say, hey, this is what I would have, or so, not instead of what I would have done, this is what you should do. Right.
So I assume what you're getting at there, man.
I'm setting you up.
Maybe. Is that... yeah, cheers. I'm antsy about mentioning it because I don't know if I'll ever finish it. But basically, yeah, I've started writing a level design book, which I started writing it like a few years ago now. And it's deliberately the idea is for it to be a small one. It's very much, it's kind of a rip-off of the idea of a series of books, 101 Things I Learned at So-and-so school, like architecture school being the big one for level design. And but it's really I've got a wonky first draft done, but it's hard to write because one thing I'm really conscious of, and I feel like is almost one of the most important things about level design to teach, is that it's really different for every game. Like, the way that you design a space even within military first person shooters is different depending on all kinds of things about those games, like whether or not this game has vehicles in, and you have to traverse spaces in vehicles and on foot, or this kind of thing. And so it's quite hard to be prescriptive about level design in a way that doesn't feel like you're kind of you're giving somebody bad advice if they interpret it badly, like in the wrong game.
But if you put tips in it, if you just say it's a tip, it's not like a law. It's not like a 101 laws of.
You run the risk of being too generalistic, I guess. If you're reduced to just saying things that are true for every kind of level design, it's going to be so general as to be useless. So yeah, that's a challenge.
Yeah, but you're right in the sense that I think there is. I mean, I'm trying to find the ways of saying like this is a useful principle that applies to a lot of things, and basically, preface the book saying like getting that point made clearly early on that it's really depends on the game. But if I was to do another talk, which I would, now I go up and like back and forth on the idea of doing another talk, I would want it to be about how to figure out how to do level design for your game. Because it's really. That's the question, really. I feel like, a lot of all the GDC talks are like, hey, this is how we did our game. And there's usually a kind of promotional element to it. And there's also like, this is how we did it, our game. And then I feel like a lot of all you've got to learn from that is like the risk there is that you're encouraging people to take things from a game that isn't theirs and kind of make it work in their game, which is really, tricky. So yes, I'm working on a book that is quite hard to write. But I am enjoying it. When I go back to it, it does feel like it's, like I say, I go up and down in terms of like feeling, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be it, especially because it's quite different. I feel like game design books have history of being really thick and textbooky, and kind of they do try to be really comprehensive, especially about game design in general. Like, it's really hard to do that, I think. So I like the idea of doing something that is not only about level design, but like really quite concise and a different approach.
I think any book that you can pick up and read a couple of things whilst you're having a coffee and spark imagination, right? Spark ideas. Because, yeah, I mean, if you have like, out of those 101 tips that you're going to give on level design, if you read a few every day, they're going to spark imagination on some things, even if they're not related to the game, that mechanic that you're kind of developing for. Peter Field has been just did a video on The Last of Us, and he had a whole bunch of tips that he was going, but are really specific to The Last of Us, right? They're like super specific to that. But what's interesting to say is like, well, as an example is, you know, if you're trying to, in one game you go up and then you come back down, right? And you go like, go up, you go to a sunny bit, which is meant to be like, oh, it was tough, it's now, you know, narratively it's now happier, now you do your level design going to much lower thing. That simple rise and fall can help with your narration, as an example. By the way, I just made that up, so but you can have that for free, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another example here was the spoilers for The Last of Us, with the scene with the giraffe where there was the anticipation building before the reveal. That's something that is generic that can be applied to your game too. If you want to reveal something, maybe build anticipation. You don't have to do it exactly like they did, but you make your own rules, you use your own mechanics, and the idea behind it is still can be universal.
Yeah, there are definitely a bunch of sections on that, like, which I am fairly sure will go in, like, you know, like I said, general principles, like the idea that the identity of something is always made stronger by kind of its opposite, you know. So like if you want to make a vista seem like epic and amazing, it feels even better if the player experiences that vista when coming from a place that is small and cramped and cold and tight, you know. And in fact, we kind of really deliberately did that at the start of the Dust District. You kind of start the level in a kind of an underground canal in a very kind of textbook Dishonored way, and you come out of this kind of cold, blue, wet, cramped, stony walled kind of underground cave of sorts, and then as soon as you step outside, it's like a massive vista of the Dust District. It's dry and it's warm and it's red and it's super open, and like it was really satisfying because it was like the most. It was really nice that the artist had exactly the same idea about how we were going to do that and why it would work. But then when we saw like the playtest footage of lots of playtesters playing it, like 3 different playtesters did like a proper Keanu Reeves like when they saw the vista. And I generally, you know, and the point there is that they weren't just going well at the vista, but they were going well at the kind of the experience of transitioning from the opposite of that vista to the vista. And so the things like, yeah, there's principles like that I think are pretty useful to...
Yeah, I think that works in storytelling too, with the contrast idea in general. Look, if you write a scene, it has to... The way it starts and the way it ends can be contrasted for a bigger impact. I'm not an expert about that, but I think it was in the... storybook by Robert McKee. Is that actually? Yeah, it was principles like that kind of be applied to, I guess, not just story but also like the level design.
There's something so powerful about games in that the player, when they see a vista like that or see something that they're not expecting, that as well as the sort of visual impact of it and the wonder and the kind of complementary aspect of the difference between where they were and where they ended up, but also the sudden expansion of the possibility space in what they understand they're going to have to do next. They see a tall building, they know, oh my god, I'm going to climb that building. They see a bridge like the Half-Life 2 bridge stretching across the water, you think, wow, I'm going to go across that bridge. And like with your example, Steve, you see the Dust District before you and you go, this is not what I expected from a Dishonored game, and suddenly I've got this huge playground to go in. So it's all those feelings going through the player. You're thinking, wow, I can be doing this and this and this and this and this, and they take that, all that combines in such a special way just for games.
Yeah, and especially if it points to kind of, like you say, a broader understanding of what the game is or something like that. Like, you just made me think of my favourite bit in Fallout 3, which I like to talk about. It's a bit quite early on when you go to Megaton, the little town. I remember I was playing it as like a good guy generally, and I remember I found this guy who was clearly a bad guy. Like, he's got a bad guy voice, he looks a bit shady, he's sitting in the pub, and I and there's a nuke at the middle of Megaton, right? He asks you to blow the bomb up and blow up the town, and you can tell that. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. And so I went to the sheriff of the town. I told the sheriff, and he was like, well, we've got to sort this guy out now. And we go over together to the bad guy, and I'm like, right, we're going to do this guy in. And then out of nowhere, kind of while they're, I can't remember what it was, how much of a cutscene it was or not, or what the kind of thing was there, but basically during gameplay, as far as I remember it, the bad guy just ends up just shooting the sheriff in front of me. And I was like, whoa, what? And then I was like, oh man, and I felt like it's kind of not betrayed, because it felt, basically it was really interesting to me because I tried to be the good guy and actually save the day, but it got the sheriff killed. And I thought, wow, is this the kind of world where it speaks to the idea that this is the kind of world where even good intentions can end up with bad things happening. And if suddenly the world felt more alive, and it felt like it wasn't just go to point A and then do step B and you get reward C. It was way more. It felt like a world to me, and I remember just thinking, if the rest of the game is like this, that's amazing. Like, it's just the sense that it's real people you're dealing with, and not just like NPC mission vendors who are gonna
and missions that are very prescribed, right? Because like you would have expected that the sheriff shot the guy, you gain some credits or caps or something like that, and that leads to another branch of your character development within that game. But now you're like, what? Now you've got a sheriff killed, and the guy's still pointing a gun at you, right?
And there's also the knowing that I could have, because that has the VAT system where you can kind of stop time and shoot people. I could have just shot him first, but I wasn't fast enough, and I got the sheriff killed. And it's little, like, knowing that I could have done it differently as well is a huge part of it. And
does that make you want to reload the save and change the outcome?
I can't remember if I did.
Because that's a big thing with, for example, Dishonored 2 or Dishonored 1 is being able, if you fail a stealth section, be able to load back and be like, I'm going to retry it. So I wonder, with those kind of outcomes in games, how much people do actually rewind or reload a different save and get back into it.
I had that with the Overseer in Dishonored 1. If you remember, he's behind that kind of fake fireplace in the kind of high bit above a large room with lots of hanging lamps. And I did this incredible series of blink moves, which I've never been able to replicate, where I bounced across all the lights, and no one saw me. And I slid through the fireplace and killed the Overseer. And this is approximately about 2 minutes into the level. I thought, oh no, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't want to end it that quickly. So I reloaded and did it all differently, even though it was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the help with that stuff is that, like, I remember thinking about that and thinking, like, it's totally cool for me if, like, people reloading their games a lot in Dishonored, like I do that a lot, and I like it. I like to think that players do that because it helps them explore the possibility space of what all the interesting things they can do. I suppose the ones where you'd hope that they stick with narrative consequences, I'm okay with them, like, oh, I didn't want to kill that guy, reload my game kind of thing. Although I suppose it's tricky because that gameplay is kind of woven with the narrative. But like generally, I think it's cooler when maybe negative narrative stuff happens, but you kind of live with it and you just accept that as part of the game and part of the narrative.
It's great that you can have a world that's resilient enough to do that. For example, your example of Fallout 3, the world scripting was resilient enough to cope with that eventuality, and it ran with it, and you felt like it was part of your story rather than something you felt like you'd done wrongly and it had gone wrong and you'd had a suboptimal outcome and things felt a little bit broken.
Yeah, and also just the genuine sense of surprise. Like it's really, it's so, like in storytelling and screenwriting, surprise is kind of the whole, not like, massive jack-in-a-box surprises, but just like not knowing what's going to happen next and being, surprised to some degree all the time is part of storytelling. I feel like in games there's way too much, and I'm going to get ranty here, like there's a lot of stuff in games which is just kind of, when you think about it, you kind of knew it was always, it's just another quest where you do this, or it's just another thing where you do this. And like genuine surprises are so rare that it's like they really stand out, and they should be, I mean, it's hard to do, so they should be more normal ideally, but it's hard to do. But it's just, all the memorable stuff is surprises, right? Like it makes me think of...
But you have to have like a balance. Like, for example, in the original XCOM, right? Your favorite guys will suddenly get shot by an alien from somewhere, right? And that's what you start expecting that. You're expecting that the game is random enough that people don't matter, that your players don't, well, your pawns don't matter in the game. But in this, you had like all the signifiers of it mattering, right? It was like, this guy obviously has a story arc that I'll figure out later or whatever, and it getting cut down. You're like, whoa, wait a minute.
But that was, to me, that again, that makes that's part of what makes the XCOM thing memorable, is that when it kind of breaks, you realize that nobody on the team is special, and everybody can die and all that kind of thing. Yeah, and it's like, like I say, it just reminded me of another kind of all-time great moment for me, and it was in like, I hope I don't get this wrong. I think it was Metro 2033, a first-person shooter thing, quite story-driven first-person shooter, made in, I don't want to get this wrong. I think it was made in Ukraine by A4. They had a weird team name, I can't remember, but there was kind of an underground section where you're in a minecart, in one of those minecarts where like somebody stood on the back pushing it up and down to go. And this is a world where there's like, it's kind of post-apocalyptic with these weird mutated alien things around. And you're going down this minecart thing, and there's, you know, typical Half-Life style, you're on a train and there's dialogue going, kind of cutscene-y thing. And then it turns into what seems like a typical kind of on-rails shooter thing where aliens are coming at you and you've got to shoot these guys as you're speeding down this track. Shoot the aliens with your teammate NPC guys. And then I remember I was working on Bulletstorm at the time, where we had a lot of really scripted on-rails shooting sections as well, and where we didn't really take into account what happens if the player does this very, very much, I don't think. But in Metro 2033, in the section, I remember you shooting at the aliens, and at some point it just feels like, oh, there's too many of them, I can't keep up, and they grab one of your NPC guys off the train and just pull him off. And they're like, oh my God. But then you kind of assume, oh, it's probably scripted, I'm going to keep going and shoot all these geezers, all the aliens. And then at some point, they get to you, or in my playthrough at least, because I don't know, I think it's not scripted. They got to me and they threw me off the train, and I figured, well, okay, that's game over. I was waiting for the game to kind of fade to black, and the game just continued, and the minecart just sped down the track away from me, and I was like, what do I do now? Is the game like
come back, guys,
or something? And I was like, oh man, and I started sprinting down the track. And running after the train into the darkness after this train, and the NPC is like shouting my name, and I'm running towards the train, and I'm thinking like, is this still the game? I can't believe this is still happening. And I'm running towards the train. I jump back on, and we start going again, and I shoot my way out.
I think that's a great moment, actually. Yeah, I remember that too. I was playing that game, but the latest thing that I remember that surprised me as much as this did, well, like for you, was like the Resident Evil 7 part. I don't know if you guys played Resident Evil. So just right at the beginning, where spoiler alert, your arm gets chopped off, and you're like, wait, is this did I just lose the game? Is this game over? Is it a blast game? But then you actually play it like that, and there's a section where you continue playing, and that's just like this most surprising thing. You don't actually, your main player character doesn't get mutilated and survive, and there's gameplay moments happening after that. Usually it's game over. So that's,
yeah, right, you get fade to black, so then, right?
That's very much a thing. I think it's in the same category of what you're describing.
Yeah, just when the game, it goes to another level of kind of immersion, because there's a genuine like, I don't know how this works. There's a genuine like, how what do I do now? Whereas, basically in all games, you kind of know how the game works. It's all being balanced so that you can make this fight, with the weapons you have and all this kind of stuff. And just those moments when the game actually dares to let you be outside of that comfort bubble in an interesting way, in a genuinely dramatic way, is like, oh, I thought that was what video games are for. We should all be doing that. Those kind of weird moments.
Brilliant. Let's do it.
Yeah. Just completely baffle players all the time.
Yeah, like a changed genre halfway through. It's like, I thought this was a first-person shooter.
Wait, wasn't that what Fahrenheit did? And it didn't work out so well, though, did it?
I don't know if it changed genre. It just, the story. Oh, yeah, I loved half of Fahrenheit. Like the good bits of Fahrenheit, I loved, yeah.
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorite games. And then it just kind of shifted direction. I was not ready for it. That was
like narratively, it certainly went weird. But I remember the demo of that game was basically the first 15 minutes of it, and with the split screen stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if you get and it's just like that was one of the games and demos where I remember playing that and thinking, this is the future of games.
Yeah.
This is what I want games to be. I want them to be really interactive cinematic things where it feels like I'm genuinely thinking with some degree of real world logic and making interesting choices that have consequences on the narrative. And because as much as like the whole systemic stealth game, like kind of Dishonored end of systemic gameplay is really interesting to me, like just it genuinely interactive cinematic feeling stuff is still one of the things I'm kind of most interested in. And not just cinematic in a kind of like it looks like a movie, and not anything to do with the less interactive side of cinema, but just the dramatic quality of cinema, which I think games still struggle with a lot of the time. And whenever a game manages to pull that off, I'm like, oh man, I remember like thinking this is just what games should be. One of the things that games should be. You know, I really love that stuff. So yeah, the good bits of Fahrenheit were amazing, I thought.
Is there a game you played recently that impressed you just as much?
I've got to say, I'm a bit out of the loop. I'm reaching this point where I think I'm officially old. I'm playing like old. I find a lot of the stuff I'm playing at the moment is like remasters of old games that I liked. Like I just bought the Command and Conquer remastered thing, and because I love that game, and I've kind of gone in and out of phases of still playing Red Alert Online, that kind of weird freeware version of it.
I think one recent game which really just completely threw me and did so many unexpected things was Edith Finch, where I genuinely didn't know where it was going when each vignette happened. Some of them were more conventional than others, but some of them were just devastatingly emotional and really joyous, and it was really a very fascinating exercise in not giving the player what they expect. Just taking it into the realms of fantasy. Yeah,
I think also Edith Finch had moments where you knew what was going to happen, but you didn't want it to, which is kind of the opposite. But it's also a great way to bring drama to the game. It's just like, oh, okay, no, I know what's going to happen. Please don't, and then it just happens and just hits you just as hard, I think, as something surprising you.
Particularly when you're given the option to delay that. And you do delay it, and you delay it, and you delay it, and you think, well, actually, I've got to let this happen. And that's a painful thing to understand, that this is something that effectively has happened, and you just got to let it happen, even if it's a tragedy.
Oh, I'm curious. I've got to go back to it now. That's an interesting one, because that makes me think of, weirdly, it made me think of Another World, like this really old 16-bit game, and which is kind of a precursor. It was one of the inspirations behind Ico, apparently, and all kinds of things. And it's like one of the things about that, which again feels really cinematic. That game feels, even though it's another side-scrolling, action-y game, it feels really cinematic because I think the mechanics throughout that game change all the time. Like, it's not just a game about jumping and shooting. It's like you do all kinds of stuff. At some point in that game, you're trapped in an alien tank, and you've got like a first-person view of a keypad, and you're just pressing loads of buttons, hoping this alien tank will drive out of this place you're in, and all kinds of weird stuff. And that in itself makes it feel cinematic. And I've got this theory that it's because, and I think this is one of the reasons why games struggle with story in some ways, is that like story, and just to be clear, I'm like a wannabe screenwriter as well. That's why I think about this stuff a lot. Like story is like.
Right, now it comes to light.
Like story is fundamentally something that changes all the time. Like story is just change. That's kind of what story is. And that, whereas with games, because of all these interactive constraints we have, where you need to be able to play it for this amount of hours apparently, and it needs to be fun, and the player needs to be able to understand the interaction in order to do it. Usually it creates this need for core mechanics, which means that you're doing the same thing over and over again, which I think has a fundamental tension with story in some ways, because in stories, ideally, you're doing the thing you're doing, or the situation you're in has to change, and in a character-driven way. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that mechanics-driven games struggle with.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that, because if you imagine like a story progressing through a game, and then at the last bit of the game is just another shooting gallery, then how has the gameplay evolved in the same way that the story evolved? It's just it doesn't have the same impact. It also needs to change in the same way. And I think definitely games struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, it's like how do we make this 9th combat encounter dramatically progressive? How does this progress the narrative? And it's like it goes back to like I've always felt, as much as I love, like, Uncharted 2 and The Last of Us are, like, pretty classic games to me, but, like, I still feel like if they got rid of 5 of the more generic combat sections, they would be objectively better games. But we don't do that because of, like, commercial constraints and all this kind of, and you know, ideas about what games should be or what they need to be to provide a certain gameplay length and value and all this kind of stuff. And then you mentioned Edith, and that's really interesting how it's especially for an indie game that they managed to create so many different things that you do and you are, you know, all this, you're really doing different things.
I think they really put it all in. I say put it on the game from what I was reading a while back, so my memory's rusted on this. This was like 13 or 18 different prototypes that they had, and they went, instead of going like, yes, we're going to use one, they went, all of them, let's put them all in there.
This is the game. Yeah, and like I said, I think it lends itself to, like, if you have a game where you do all these different things, then it means that you're inherently bringing new experiences and a journey, a real journey, rather than like doing the same thing but then seeing cutscenes where people talk about different things. And if you can find a way to do that in a cost efficient way, it's always interesting, I think. But it's just insanely, you know, it's hard to do that. I assume that game took ages to make.
Yeah.
I went to see the talk at GDC, and they talked about how it took a long time. Yeah.
I mean, all I'm going to say is that at the end they put pictures of them before and after, and all of them being like babies.
The babies at the beginning, they look like the unicorn at the end.
Yeah, like
Wow, deep reference there, Robert.
I think I've always been interested in level design as a story thing, and like I feel like I don't know, things have kind of slowed. And I was going to say things have slowed down in terms of the games that I'm interested in. I feel like there's less of them now because like I'm less. I don't really play long open world games, and so I'm sure there is some awesome stuff going on in these games, but I don't feel like playing a game that long, and so I wish there was, you know, there's all this talk of like the immersive sim not being commercial enough anymore for AAA and stuff like that, and I don't know. I'm trying to think what I do wish there's still a longing I have for the. Not just first-person games, but just level design-y games where storytelling through level design is a really big thing, and more than not just environmental storytelling, because I think that's been kind of done pretty well. But it's like level design through what the player does. Yeah, which Edith Finch is probably one of the best recent examples of that.
I think Naughty Dog is really trying to push on that. I think that's kind of their main goal. Like if you played even The Last of Us DLC, where they had so many different mechanics. You could go into this shop in the mall and you could wear different monster masks and kind of play around, fool around, and that kind of showed that Ellie was, you know, still a kid and showed her innocence. And then you contrast that with the world and the combat sections that they have afterwards. So it's definitely moving away from, hey, here's just like, you know, in Uncharted, here's all the combat sections, pew pew, then cutscene. And it has extra mechanics, or it changes how the mechanics work before, and maybe for a particular section, and that kind of also goes hand to hand with the story and the level itself.
I think it contextualizes mechanics quite a lot, you know, because I think Uncharted, for example, I always found that odd, same as kind of some Indiana Jones films in which he could just kill loads of people, but then be this lovely professor that teaches archaeology, which I know I'm conflating two of them, but come on, Uncharted is Indiana Jones, right? But do you know what I mean? He's like this lovable rogue, and next thing you know, you've murdered a whole bunch of people. But in The Last of Us, it just is kind of like, oh no, if you start killing people, there's a super good reason for it, and you can contrast, as we were saying at the beginning, with the character's growth and deviation from the norm as we would expect it, right? Because you don't expect a small girl to go out and kill.
Yeah, and there were bits in that game that I loved as well. Like even the very start of it, when you play Joel's daughter, and there's a bit where you've jumped in the car and you're starting to see, again, in kind of that classic kind of video game train mode where you see the world around you going crazy. And I love that in that game. It's not just like, I mean, on one level they could have just made that a cutscene. I'm glad they didn't. And then you could have just been in the car looking around. But I loved the touch that because they're Naughty Dog and they do this to such an insanely high quality. Just looking around the car, the way that you see Joel's daughter kind of reach around the car and look, move to the other seat to look through the other window and stuff like that. It really felt like, oh, I know what that's like to be in, to crawl around the car and look around the windows kind of thing. And that was super, like, it's gone down as a great opening to a game, and just the way that you experience everything up to the cutscene, where
Yeah, and I think it really serves the point that there were the opening and the story at that point, because you're experiencing the destruction of your everyday world through the eyes of a vulnerable little girl. And that's why in the beginning it's just that you're that person, you can't fight back, you have nothing, and I think it makes you more panicky, more scared about just like the characters are feeling. So that also, like the gameplay and the mechanic there, even though it's simple, just looking around the car or like moving around the house, I mean, how hard is that, right? It's simpler than creating a whole, like, I don't know, inventory system, let's say, but that serves the actual story. And that's why I think also that the 20-minute opening of The Last of Us was impactful, because they let you play as that character.
It sets up the entire game as well. It's like from that point on, you see the downfall of the world, you get the sense of feeling vulnerable, and basically throughout that entire game, scarce resources, you're weak, you're on, like, you don't have the upper hand really at any point throughout this game. It's like you're always on the downtrodden version of it as well.
And do you understand why Joel is the way he is, without having to have some sort of audio log or thing to read or something? You've actually seen it and you've experienced it and you were part of that, so you understand much more about the character. And that's the way to build up characters, is to experience what they've gone through.
Yeah, I think that opening could have gone wrong in so many ways, but it just worked, and then the rest of the game built on that, and that worked too. Yeah.
And I love the ending as well. The ending of The Last of Us.
Oh my god, especially since the other one's coming out.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Yeah.
Oh.
I think we can spoil an old game. Right?
The thing I remember about it was just when it finished, I was like, that was good in a way that a good film is. Like, genuinely, the quality of that story is actually as good as a film, which is unfortunately still a bar that is quite hard for games to hit. I think not that. I think it's partly because games don't aspire to do that most of the time, and quite rightly so, and all the kind of thing. But like, for the kind of for what it was going for, it did it. It was really like it's one of those games where I did imagine like, I wonder if they could have done the ending like this, and there's a lot of alternate endings and ways of handling that ending that could have been interesting. But
you just want the dog that's been like manipulating everything from in the UFO, right? The dog in the UFO manipulating
every
everything.
game.
People can actually see a great dog. This is how you came on my radar, because you did a great GDC talk a few years back. I don't know how many.
I can't remember. It's probably 2017, I think.
No, 3 years back, I think.
A few years ago, yeah.
So in normal years there'll be 3, but up in pandemic years it's about 2 years ago you did it, which really helps new designers understand the whole process. I mean, about how all the different things have to fit together for it to work, right?
I hope so. Because looking back at it now, it's one of the key ideas in it was that whereas I think we normally talk about games in terms of like story and graphics and gameplay kind of thing, and I can't remember when it occurred to me that the topics could be all the stuff that comes in between them. So the topics I talked about were like affordances and intentionality, and how that comes out of the relationship between the presentation of a game and the gameplay, and then like interactive narrative being a thing between gameplay and narrative, and world building being a combination of like art and story, essentially. Presentation and story. Yeah, that was struck me like as how my favorite moments in games have struck me. It's when it's like Half-Life 2 really struck me as something where it's like, wow, every aspect of this game is really high quality, like not in a cinematic way, but cinematic quality. I thought, where I felt like I was playing the story and I was seeing the story in the world, and all of that stuff worked together really well. And yeah, just kind of, I'm really happy that I managed to figure out a way to articulate that in some way.
For our listeners, you can go and check him out on the YouTubes or your nearest vault of GDC content.
It's called An Approach to Holistic Level Design. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with it. Like I say, I still think about other talks now and again, and I've thought about doing it as a lockdown thing as well, just to make sense right now to, I don't know, filming talks is really hard though. Like, it's really, because when you do it as a talk, you can kind of prepare for months, and you kind of like, you treat it like a talk, and it's a different thing. And like, in the same way that being on a podcast or a panel is different, because you don't plan, and you just kind of hope you can wing it and not say anything embarrassing. But then like with recording a talk, it's a weird mix of the because I tried it a while back. It's a weird mix of like kind of scripting and practicing something, but then trying not to sound like you're just reading from a script, and all this kind of thing. It's quite tricky. Anyway, yeah, I've thought about doing like another talk on like layout design, because that's one of the big ones that I think everybody wants. But again, I don't think it's been done because it's hard to say how you should approach level layout design for all kinds of games. But again, I think there are some principles that could be, that are useful, that could be applied to lots of different games. But yeah, I'm really pleased with the GDC talk. It's almost one of the things I almost like it a lot more than stuff I've done in games in a different way, because it's very, not because I'm not happy with the game stuff, but it's more, I think I'm just I love thinking about stuff in that kind of way, and so it feels very me that I kind of did a talk in a way, because I feel like it's, I don't know. And I suppose it's also a thing. It's different to the games, certainly the AAA game stuff, because it was just me, and it's kind of different. Whereas like, with Dishonored 2, I'm really kind of sitting on standing on the shoulders of giants and all the other people helping making that game, and the end product is like is in some ways not always what you intended it to be, but it's cool in a different way and all this kind of stuff. So it's nice to do a talk where it's just like, this is just me, and I've got to figure out how to make this interesting for an hour.
It's a self-reliance thing as well. It's like, there is like group projects or work that you do with a whole bunch of people that takes a lot of people, and doing it by yourself. Steve, if people want to get hold of you, ask you questions about level design, I'm sure people want to pick your brains. What's the best way they can contact you?
Twitter is fine. Like, you can stalk me on Instagram, but there's not an ideal place for level design questions. It was actually something I was thinking of opening up more officially. Like, so my Twitter handle is SL2, which is ESSELL2. I wish I could have it without the 2, but somebody else stole it. My DMs are open, and I am genuinely open to like taking questions and stuff. And I've actually, another thing I'm supposed to be writing is like just an FAQ of level design questions that I've kind of heard a lot over the years, and I've thought, it only just occurred to me recently that I could do it as a video, like the youngsters do on YouTube.
Yep.
I could do a video,
YouTube.
but
hey, you could do an Instagram story.
That would be even cooler. I'll do a TikTok. A level design TikTok.
Yeah.
With like some puppies in the background, like somersaulting and stuff.
Come on, game developers, we can't take over TikTok. It's gonna be so awkward.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Valentina, if people want to throw questions at you.
So you can find me on Twitter at Valentina Chrys, that's CHRYS.
And Jonathan?
As always, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Omni/92.
And Rob?
And you can find me on Twitter, RM McLaughlin. That's RMMCLACHLAN.
Awesome. We're going to put those Twitter links on the feed. And if you want to contact me for whatever reason, I don't know why you would, I'm at Mark Drew on the Twitters. Thank you very much. It's been an awesome episode, and I'll bid you all a lovely good night. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
The Level Design Podcast has been a Command Studio production. Our editor is Matthew Lever, and this episode has been produced by Bridie Rose.